and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. So if you save your questions till the end, we'll also monitor the chat online to see if there's any questions there that we need to get around to. And yeah, just a final note from me to stay tuned. We've got loads of VoxDevLits coming out over the next couple of months on political polarization, migration, educational technology, and other topics. And the good thing about the lits is they're updated every 18 months or so. So they're always relatively close to the frontier of research. So that's me done. I'll hand over.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Feel free to ask questions like during the, don't need to wait until the end. Okay. I'm Francisco, and together with Allan, we are very happy to finally launch this survey here. This one, we had contributions from Heitor and Eduardo. And so thank you, Oliver, for keeping us on track. Robin and VoxDev for incentivizing us in writing this. And so, right. So this will be a survey, short survey on deforestation, and we are focusing on the literature in economics, right? So we had to make this clear cut because otherwise we wouldn't fit on 15 pages. So sorry, we are going to make some people not so happy, but like we had to set some limits. And second, as Oliver said, I think the goal of VoxDevLit is to provide kind of a literature review that makes research more accessible for a broader audience, like policymakers, students, and also I think researchers from other areas that they wouldn't stop to read a full 50-page survey. Okay? And I think a second goal of ours in this survey is like showcase that while force may think like looks like something that's very distant and niche, it's a theme that cuts across several economic fields, and we are going to show like research being conducted in different fields. We still have a lot of open questions, so please feel free to contribute. So hopefully some of you are going to identify points that they are on your research or policy corner that you can contribute or learn something. Okay. So what's the roadmap for today? First, we are going to talk about agricultural production as a main driver of deforestation. And here we are going to and get more material from the development and agricultural literature. Then we are going to think about deforestation agents as firms conducting economic activity. And here we can borrow from the literature on IO and structural models, so we can think about policy counterfactors in a more structured way. Then we are going to say that like these agents that they operate in isolation, they trade, they migrate, etc. So we are going to link with the trade and migration literature. And last, we are going to think about how political constraints on what we can do about deforestation. Okay, so I'm going to start, and then I'm going to hand over to Allan. Okay, so yesterday, like Juliano and José made very clear that forest preservation is very important for carbon emissions, one of the main source of carbon emission in the world. Massive amount of forest, especially tropical forest, has been lost in this century. We saw yesterday how forest conservation looks like a cheap and very promising way to reduce global emissions, both through preservation and also like some carbon capture. But no, and beyond carbon emissions, like forests also provide, they host a vast amount of biodiversity. They provide ecosystem service for areas very far from forests, like regularizing rainfall, humidity, etc. And they provide the means of life for millions of people that live in forests. Okay, so this is a global context. And the two hotspots of deforestation are Brazil and Indonesia. So these are the two top countries on annual forest loss in the century. So most of the research is focused on these two, right? So today we are going to talk mostly about evidence from these two. There are some scattered evidence from other places, but it's mostly Brazil and Indonesia. Here, C and Africa are very important, but there is very little research. So here's already like a shout out for an area that needs more research, deforestation in Africa, okay? And in Brazil and Indonesia, what's the main driver of deforestation is agricultural expansion. In Brazil, cattle ranching and crops, soybeans. In Indonesia, palm oil, right? There are some particularities that we can learn different things from these different contexts. So in Brazil, up until 2004, we had the highest deforestation rate in the world. And the Brazilian government started this massive program, PPCDAN, that's a national action plan, combining a series of policies to try to control and reduce deforestation. This policy, we are going back to that, they have been very effective. In the last decade or so, weekend enforcement like kind of reverse part of this process, right? So there is a lot of policy to learn from this evidence. In Indonesia, it has another particularity that's like the central government controls most of the forest state. There's been massive area of deforestation, but there is a distinction feature of Indonesia that they have this carbon rich like peatlands. So when you deforest, especially using fire, that's the most common. Not only you release the carbon from the trees, but also on the ground. So this potentializes of the emission. All right. So first, agricultural production is the main driver. And here we are going to group the literature in 3 points that I'm going to go one by one. First is, all right, so if agriculture is the main driver, we should think about improving agricultural productivity as a way of intensified production, reduce the pressure over the forest. Let's think about that. Then we are going to think about how can we use policies to reshape the incentives of people on the ground and reduce deforestation. And third, we are going to think about poverty reduction programs, that they align or not, that they can be helpful to decrease deforestation. Okay. So first, the productivity debate. So there are 2 main hypotheses, right? There is the Borla hypothesis, named after a Nobel laureate, that's higher productivity, increase intensification, so you need less land to produce the same amount of output. So this reduces the pressure on the extensive margin of agriculture. On the other hand, there is the Jordan's paradox that say like actually higher productivity reduce your marginal cost, makes marginal plots of land more profitable. So actually incentivize, creates incentives for you to expand production towards marginal plots, right? So which one is right? It depends. So in theory, Farouk and all, they reconcile these 2 and show that like the elasticity of demand for the agricultural product is very important, right? So if you have highly inelastic demand, higher productivity, just reduce price, but doesn't increase the quantity of agricultural products. So you need less land to produce. If you have an elastic demand, on the other hand, high productivity is going to reduce price, but it's going to increase a lot of production. And this increase in production may also like increase the demand for land, expanding the forest, right? When you look at evidence, I think the evidence kind of aligns with this intuition, right? You have evidence that intensification programs on smallholders in serving local markets actually reduce deforestation. So here we should think about technical assistance programs for subsistence farming and these things. But there is also evidence that agricultural productivity gains in commercial settings where you have agricultural production to serve international markets like commodities. What this creates, like as you become more productive, change your comparative advantage, leads to specialization, increasing pressure on the forest and leading to deforestation. Right. So we need to understand this more, like these trade-offs, and how to design, how to think about productivity without the environmental footprint. So second, policy interventions in the agriculture, trying to mitigate the expansion of agricultural frontier. Here, Brazil is key exactly because we had basically this lab with several policies being implemented at the same time. And a lot of research done trying to slice these big policies into the different components. Julian has a lot of work on this. So we have showed that using remote sensing data to provide like hotspot, like heat maps in real time to inform enforcement to act. It's very effective and cost effective. Condition subsidized agricultural credit to environmental compliance farmers seems to be also effective. Creation of protected areas is seems to have modest effects. This is a much more open debate, like we saw something today. And also like some targeted policies such as priority list municipalities that they create higher enforcement on higher deforestation pressures. But this is higher enforcement, higher incentives on the both on the private sector, but also to local politicians, local mayors. And so when you align, create like higher enforcement, align incentives between local politicians and local economic elite, this also seems to be effective, right? And so good, we have a good starting point to think about policies to maintain or continue to reduce deforestation, but there is also research that the effectiveness of policies vary with underlying pressure, right? Both from markets, commodity price, trade pressure, etc., and from politics, political constraints that may undermine the effectiveness of policies. Okay. And Allan is going to talk more about this. So the other big umbrella that we did is how can we think about aligning poverty reductions and jobs with conservation, right? And so there is some research that direct payment is a promising tool. Direct payments here, we can think about payment for environmental service. But research also showed that design details matter a lot. Credibility, additionality, figuring out what's the right price that you have to pay. So details matter. There's another literature on unconditional cash transfers. And even yesterday on the proposals, there was like some, one of the proposals included some kind of universal basic income. So we need to understand like, all right, so if we do some cash transfer, universal basic income, how this will shape deforestation. Evidence here is mixed. So there is evidence from Mexico, opportunities that cash transfer actually increased local demand for goods, so increasing deforestation. And Brazil, there is this Bolsa Verde that's kind of a cash transfer in regions that they are more high value of preserving the natural habitat, but they are unconditional. And there is some evidence that it's weak evidence that they reduce deforestation, but definitely I think we can reject the hypothesis that they increase deforestation. So evidence here is mixed, and I think we need more work on that. And a more incipient literature that I think would also deserve more attention is thinking about alternative pathways to create jobs and create local economic activities that they are off farm, that they are kind of, that they align the incentives of the economic activity and the preservation. So there are some papers on tourism and ecotourism in Colombia and Brazil. There are papers on green jobs. So if you're going to have active restoration projects like that, you're planting trees, this creates jobs. So it's a way also like to shift works from deforestation towards reforestation. And yes, okay. So Bottom line, I think the main takeaways from this part that we think like for future work and policy, first to think about policy. First is like, we need productivity programs to promote intensification, increase yields of farmers in this area. We want agricultural productivity to increase, but we have to think of how to pair this without compromising the extensive margin of crops, right? So we need more research to understand this, how to pair these two things. We need credible enforcement tools. So here, the Brazil experience points to several promising avenues, satellite monitoring, condition price transfer, etc. And I say credible because this needs to be sustainable over time, because I think credibility is key for unlocking carbon credit revenue, as being discussed yesterday, and this won't come from Vera and etc. So we need how to credibly account all this carbon to bill for it. And we need to think how can we align economic opportunity and jobs with conservation, steering jobs away from forest degrading sectors or activities. And last, and we are going to, Allan's going to talk more about this, what's politically viable, right? What's politically sustainable? We need to consider political constraints on all these levels. Okay, so with that, I leave Allan to continue.
Great, so I'll pick up where Chico has left off. What I want to highlight in this discussion so far that's centered on agricultural development, economic development, poverty reduction, is that deforestation is a very nice setting in which we can study these classic questions in development economics related to investment in agriculture and poverty reduction programs. And what we're going to do throughout the rest of this literature review is to kind of pull that thread through other fields of economics. I'm going to touch on trade, I'm going to touch on industrial organization, I'm going to touch on political economy, and I'm going to argue that whether or not you care about deforestation, and you should, because it is of first order importance as we think about meeting our climate goals. But even if you didn't care fundamentally about deforestation and you just cared about these deep questions in trade, in industrial organization, in political economy, this is a very nice data-rich setting in which you can explore these questions. So that's where we're going to go. So I'm going to start with the sort of industrial organization side of things, where IO has developed very rich firm-level frameworks for modeling what firms' incentives are and how firms respond to environmental regulation, including in the context of land use and agricultural land use, where we have these rich models that tell us how to think about firms expanding agricultural activity over land and choosing how to use land. And we saw this actually even in Lucy's talk, where developers are thinking about how to use land for real estate. There's going to be kind of nice analogous ties to here, where developers or farmers are thinking about how to use land for agriculture. Now, what's the main value of these models? These models, which will require us to make sort of a larger set of assumptions. The value of these economic models is that, importantly, they will allow us to simulate regulation in hypothetical counterfactual forms, and therefore to ex ante evaluate policy that has not yet been implemented in the world. And furthermore, through simulating counterfactual policy, allow us to optimize over the kind of policy parameters that we're interested in. Now, what's nice about the deforestation setting, and especially deforestation as it relates to agriculture, relative to the typical bread and butter IO setting of a cardboard factory or a sort of ketchup factory, is that actually, like the cement or cardboard or ketchup, agriculture is also a nice, well-defined, somewhat homogeneous kind of industry where we have a good idea of what the production function is. Okay, but I'd argue that the food supply of the world is kind of more interesting than the cardboard supply of the world. What's the value of that? If we have a good sense of the production function, then that really helps in estimation. In an agricultural setting, it helps because we know from scientific models what crop yields are and how those crop yields vary across space. We also know the carbon consequences of developing on this plot of land relative to that plot of land. Why? Because we know where the trees are. And so actually, I would argue even better than the typical industrial organization setting where you have factory level data, and you have to assume that all production in the factory operates with the same level of carbon emissions because you can't really see the individual lines at play within the factory. In the agricultural setting, you see all of the land. And you know, and therefore, you know on the margin as the farm develops here or there what emissions are and what costs are. Because you measure both emissions via the free stocks and costs and benefits via the changes in crop yields and crop productivity across states through the scientific. Okay, so the theme here then is that deforestation is a data-rich setting that allows us to get a little bit more traction, even relative to the typical bread and butter IO setting. But we're also going to benefit from the very rich dynamic frameworks that IO has developed to think about forward-looking firms and how they think about the future and how they think about current versus future regulation. And what's nice in the deforestation setting is you can measure via satellites deforestation over time and agricultural productivity over time, which means you have panel data, which means you have dynamic data, which is important. You can't estimate a dynamic framework without dynamic data. You need the data over time. You have that in the deforestation setting. And then lastly, and this kind of echoes other pockets of use of scientific engineering models throughout environmental economics. Also in the deforestation, we can benefit from the scientific climate models that have been developed that help us to think about evapotranspiration, how that interacts with deforestation, to enrich our economic models with scientific understanding. Okay, so then as we think about policy takeaways in future work, where do we want to go, both as policymakers and as academics? We want to take very seriously the incentives that the market presents firms with, and whether these incentives encourage deforestation or not. We also want to think about dynamic responses because firms, to the extent that they are forward-looking, are thinking and reacting not only to regulation today, but also regulation tomorrow. And so what you want is permanent, durable, politically durable regulation. And you want to be able to model how firms react differently to regulation that will be in place for a long time relative to a short time. Again, the dynamic machinery from IO helps us to do. And furthermore, with the careful firm level modeling, we're going to be able to simulate careful design of individual intervention programs. That's what the model is going to allow us to chase additionality and maximize the impact of our interventions. So now we're going to go from the firm level to the global level. And we're going to make the point that trade and migration shape the impacts of regulation. And the theme that's going to come up here is sort of rich general equilibrium forces that deforestation, again, is going to be a nice context to study. So we'll start with space then. Space coming from kind of spatial economics, talking about spatial interaction and how the activity of one farm impacts farms around it with spatial spillovers and spatial externalities. You see that in deforestation. You see that in deforestation, which is spatially concentrated. And so we see the arc of deforestation in Brazil and this frontier that moves, but in a sort of spatially concentrated way. That's deeply connected to kind of fire setting, which have spatial externalities. I set fire to slash and burn on my plot, but then it spreads to my neighboring plots. Deforestation is a setting where these spatial spillovers and spatial externalities are important. All of that happens within a country potentially. And so even within a country, you have this rich spatial element, which again, you can observe through the satellite data. You can see both that spatial heterogeneity. And if you want to go deep in that direction, you can model the spatial interaction with these tools from spatial economics. But then if we extend beyond the borders of a particular country, we also can highlight the important global perspective that comes in global general equilibrium, where regulation in Brazil, because Brazil is a large agricultural producer and exporter, that regulation in Brazil impacts Brazilian agricultural prices, which in turn impact global agricultural prices, and therefore, importantly, in general equilibrium, through this equilibrium force at global scale, regulation in Brazil impacts American farmers, Chinese farmers, Japanese farmers very far away. The trade models are going to allow us to kind of capture that rich equilibrium component of the impacts of regulation. Okay, so then what's nice about deforestation and deforestation data relative to the bread and butter computable general equilibrium modeling in trade? What is it that the focus on deforestation buys? Again, it comes down to the data at granular scale. Okay, so first off, the deforestation data are available globally, and so in a somewhat harmonized globally kind of way with comparable data across countries, one can now model at global scale how different countries are interacting with the same common set of data points. Okay, furthermore, again, because we observe deforestation at very granular scale, down to 30 meters by 30 meters, similar to the factory analogy in IO, when we're talking about trade, we no longer need to assume that every unit of production in China has 3 tons of carbon per unit of production, where we pull the 3 out of so hopefully some data, but sort of coarse data. There's a sense with the deforestation data, because they're measured at micro scale, we know on the margin where that next unit of production from Chinese agriculture is coming, because we've modeled agriculture across space in China and we measure agricultural activity across space in China. And therefore we know on the margin is the extra unit of agriculture coming from forested land, unforested land, heavily forested land. Okay, so again, the deforestation data, which are available at comparable global scale, give us a bit more data insight to enrich the kind of macro trade models with a bit more micro data. That's the value of the deforestation focus within international trade. To close this out, then there's a sort of smaller but important literature about global supply chains, which I think is very nice because it connects the local problem to global markets, local farmers to global markets in a very elegant way, making the point that global regulation has direct impact on local farmers, but those impacts filter through local market power, the power of large packaging, meat packers, for example, in Brazil. That's the focus of some of these papers down here. Again, the local is connected to the global in general equilibrium. Yes, please.
That point about the local and the global, and connected to Francisco's presentation earlier, what percentage of land in many of these forested areas is big commercial farms versus small farmers? I mean, like, what is the problem to focus on is really what I'm trying to ask.
It's an interesting question. It's a question that I often grapple with in Indonesia with my work on palm oil. So I know the statistics for Indonesia off the top of my head, so I'll focus the answer there. There, it's roughly 50% smallholders, 50% large agricultural conglomerates. In my own work, I punt on that a bit, partially because I'm not necessarily chasing after the smallholder, big farmer distinction. That's sort of less central to my paper on palm oil. And the way I punt on it there is to say, look, there is often vertical contracting by which the large farms provide the upfront capital to the small farms in exchange for having exclusive rights to the harvest. And so then with some market power, that vertical contracting basically means that the large companies extract all of the rents anyway. So it's kind of okay to model that kind of agricultural production as being the product of one decision maker in a way. So that's how I kind of smooth over those important complications in that particular palm oil paper. But this is great because it also reminds me, I'm sort of saying that deforestation is this fantastic, perfect data setting. There's one big flaw with the deforestation data, or one shortcoming, one pitfall, which is that this plot of land over here, is it deforested or not? A lot of trees, big trees, small trees, what kind of tree, we have all of that information. We know also for this plot of land, this plot of land. It is much more difficult to know that these 3 plots of land are connected under the same owner or not. And so as we move to local market power or monopoly power or kind of firm boundaries, that becomes much more difficult. Whereas if you were to go to the typical firm level survey data, the firm boundaries would be encoded in those survey measures. It's not with the satellite data. Okay, so the global scale and that spatial granularity does come at a cost, and that cost is usually going to be a bit more salient for these kind of IO studies where the boundaries of the firm are particularly. Thank you for the reminder. I meant to say that. Okay, so trade is about general equilibrium, rich general equilibrium forces. Deforestation is a place where the microdata allow us to kind of get a little bit more texture, granular texture on these equilibrium forces. Where do we go from here? Well, one kind of theme as we think about spatial spillovers, migration, and trade is that there may be unintended consequences of intervention and infrastructure investments and regulation. One, maybe we want to build roads into agricultural areas to support those local economies, but to the extent that there are spatial spillovers and long-run spatial spillovers, why? Because roads are durable. Then as we expand into certain areas, that's going to create spatial inertia. And now, even if there's strong regulation in those areas, the cost to deforest has gone down permanently because now it's very easy to access the trees and that agricultural land in that now kind of road invested area. And that's going to have an impact of accelerating the frontier, the expansion of the frontier. Okay, so a sort of unintended spatial consequence. Similarly, there's going to be an unintended global consequence as local regulation in a place that is a big agricultural producer reduces local demand and therefore reduces world demand and therefore reduces world prices and therefore encourages increased consumption of the agricultural product in unregulated foreign markets. Okay, as the EU regulates and pushes down its own demand, it brings down the world price. And so if China is unregulated, for the Chinese consumer, the lower world price is awesome. They're going to consume more. Their increase in consumption is partially going to offset the EU's decrease in consumption. And so there's going to be what we call leakage. Okay, the global response is going to undercut the local benefits of regulation, sort of unintended consequence. Okay, so these are spillover effects. So we know how to think about spillover effects. The way to deal with spillover effects as a regulator is to regulate in a coordinated way that accounts for those spillovers. So regional authorities can coordinate to internalize those spatial spillovers. And similarly, countries can, in principle, come together, write trade agreements, and coordinate on tariffs to minimize that. Okay, but the trade and spatial work highlights these unintended consequences. And what I want to emphasize here is that this kind of economic point that we notice translates directly into policy recommendations. From there, we can talk about political economy and political challenges. There are a number of papers really delving into the details of how local political incentives and political cycles affect deforestation, both globally and in particular country settings. And what that means is that there's going to be this element of politics that I think is very central to how the regulator needs to think about regulation. To the extent, and in new work with Robin and Francisco and Veronica and Ben Olken tomorrow, I'll be talking about how we should think about the political resistance that potentially gets induced by regulation and what that means if that political resistance is so strong that it can lead to repeal of the regulation in the first place. That's a problem that is a dynamic problem. It's very related to the dynamics that Barb was talking about yesterday. this economics of doing nothing. And Bart talked about sort of time inconsistency, which is that the incentives tomorrow are different from the incentives today. And so in this setting with repeal, this is also fundamentally dynamic. If I press too hard today and I regulate up to the level of the externality today as the regulator, there's a problem, which is that tomorrow I might be kicked out and there's zero regulation tomorrow. That's also kind of an unintended consequence. That's also kind of a leakage phenomenon. That's the leakage of impacts today on impacts tomorrow. So we see the connection with trade. And then we see the connections also to IO. The impacts, actions today, having effects tomorrow, highlights the dynamics here. And the dynamic empirical machinery from industrial organization is well suited to help us think about these dynamic economic issues. And so where do we go from here? What we want to really think about is policy, agricultural policy, environmental policy, deforestation policy, conservation policy that is politically robust and durable. And I think we're living at a time now where that political durability we see is of first order importance. Deforestation is a nice place to continue to make progress on thinking about these issues of political robustness and durability. Again, because of that spatial granularity, the deforestation setting allows us to think in well quantified ways about distributional impacts, how some people win and some people lose. And of course, those distributional impacts and that unequal incidence of regulation is where these political frictions come from. Okay, deforestation allows us to measure that unequal incidence. And then more broadly, and I've heard Meredith Fowley say this many times among others, I think we also want to shift a little bit to really thinking about second best policies. Okay, the first best Pigouvian tax is the most efficient thing theoretically. But if it's not feasible, it's not feasible. If there are political constraints, then we shouldn't feel bad about not achieving that first best policy. And instead, we want to be developing a full menu of second, third, fourth, fifth best policies to understand, first off, just how much we're losing because of that political constraint. How does the second best compare to the first best? But also, this is the realistic set of policies that we can enforce. And so we want to go there. Please.
Within this politically robust setting, what's your view for in the deforestation of the potential role of lobbying, right? The supply chain, the point that you touched upon, I guess these meat packers or palm oil, big exporters, they can exert endogenously a lot of political pressure for regulation, right?
Absolutely. And we'll actually be making exactly that point tomorrow in this paper that I'll be presenting, but that's exactly right. You have many actors within the economy that are impacted by regulation. Some of them have the ability to lobby against regulation in a coordinated way and to change whether regulation is enforced or not. And the high-level takeaway from this political economy strain of the development and sort of deforestation literature is that we want to take those forces very seriously. We don't want to ignore them.
If I can just complement, these distribution effects may also affect small players. So it's not only the big money. The small money also may be losing.
The small players eventually cannot sway policy, right? That's the thing.
Through vote.
Oh, yes, you're right.
Right, so with that, I'll just conclude. Deforestation is central to our climate goals. We've made great progress. Again, we need more work in Africa, in the Congo rainforest in particular. We need more work on biodiversity. And as we think about next steps, both as academics and as policymakers, we want to think about what curbing deforestation means for and how it interacts with economic development. We want to really benefit from the new data, which includes scientific data and scientific models. We want to really flesh out and fill out the set of policy tools that we can be thinking about for both local and global regulation. And we really want to emphasize political feasibility. And I think deforestation is a great context to be thinking about these questions. Thank you.
One question from online. So the claim was made at the beginning that national government policies in Brazil like played a key role in reversing like the deforestation trends. So someone asked like, are you confident in that claim? Like, is there good evidence supporting that it was because of policy and it wasn't because of some other like external factors like commodity prices or other factors? So yeah, just something on that.
Francisco has the paper there, so like.
No, so the period where you have this reversal, it's actually a period where like commodity prices are going down. And there is a lot of evidence on budget cuts from the environmental agents, from like, now I don't have from the top of my mind, but it's like the enforcement organs like entities, IBAMAs, etc. They have severe budget cuts on staff. And so, and there are some policies change giving amnesty for past deforestation even up until 2008, and this discussion is still being going on of trying to pardon more the crimes. So I think there is some evidence that yes, there was enforcement weakened. There was a weakening on enforcement capacity from these regulations, even if formally they didn't change so much.
Is there much understanding of differences in kind of how ownership patterns change along with deforestation? Is a kind of, I don't know, common assumption that, you know, external players come in some way, acquire the land either by purchase or expropriation and then develop it, or is it more a case of the landowners in situ there just deciding to develop their land? And how do we think about differences in payment rates affecting those trends?
I mean, the short answer is I think that's a relatively open area, in part because of data constraints. This is a place where you really need to know who owns what farm. I can say it another way, which is I know if the tree got cut. I know sort of, we all know from looking at the satellite data, a particular tree, this one tree in this place, this latitude, this longitude, we know if it got cut or not. Who cut the tree is a different, important, but difficult question. And that's sort of the data that you need to kind of get at ownership angle. And there's another element here too, which is maybe you own, but you weren't the one who cut the tree. Maybe someone else cut the tree related to tenure. Yeah.
I can say something about Brazil. Like, I think about 50% happens in like public and designated land. I think about a quarter happens in settlements or ongoing land reform is happening. And like about another quarter is private property, something like that. And it would change a lot from country to country, but a lot of it is in place. I mean, a very broad answer is a lot of it is in places where disputed property claims or less clearly defined individual property rights, but also a very large fraction happens in individually owned, well-defined property rights. Bit of everything.
Thank you. One of the things, I come from Uganda, sub-Saharan Africa, and what for me is interesting to the discussion, but because the paper, the analysis looks more at large, most for me, large scale farming, but subsistence farming and small scale is very, very important as far as deforestation is concerned from our end. And that may impact also on the solutions that we're giving, because when you look at the incentives and what they may cause, what was presented first. So it's about, for us, maybe in future is more looking at those small scale farmers in detail and see what reactions can come. And if you give incentives, we are doing that, we're giving households money to increase, it's like seed money to increase household income. But what impact will have on deforestation is another key question, and the solutions. But also most important is the kind of land ownership is what also we should be able to think about. Where I come from in Uganda, land belongs to the people. So any person can do anything on this land, whereas there's the state. So these are things also to consider as deforestation comes out and get solutions. But at the end, when it comes to what can we do, because the point is raising productivity. And how do you raise productivity? Yeah, I'm happy you talked about nature and biodiversity at the end. Probably you're going to use chemicals. What are you going to use? And this may impact more. So there's a lot of interplay and research that is needed here to talk about it, because we're talking about coverage. But what about happens about quality and biodiversity in there in terms of nature after can protect size? So these are things as you're presenting that came in my head. One of the things that may be missed, which didn't come about as a solution for me, is looking more at community practice and local solutions for bring down deforestation. Thank you. My points here.
Oh, very good. Anything to add? Yeah, no, I think it's just on the biodiversity, like, yeah, no, I think we can talk to you.
I guess at a very high level, I sort of think about a little bit of a tension between the trade approach, which is the macro approach, and therefore gets these very rich, interesting general equilibrium effects, hopefully informed by micro data, but is able to capture kind of, local regulation in Brazil impacts the Chinese consumers. That's a real effect, and that's nice to capture. But then when you go global, and you go large scale, you capture these large scale general equilibrium effects, but then your modeling is less tailored to the individual settings. And then at the other extreme, you go super tailored, super custom made for this particular setting, getting every single institutional detail right. But then you always have this trade-off of not being able to get the global effects. And so it's always this kind of balance. And so those trade models are just not going to be able to capture this important first order richness. And that's sort of a different approach. But also, Robin, you.
It looks like the state has fairly strong rights to quite a lot of the land in both Brazil and Indonesia. So, people like Esteban Rossi Handburg thinks that you could just strengthen the property rights, make them national parks or something. Then the evidence is that national park land, wherever you look, it's still deforested. So I guess the question is, what is the reason that doesn't happen? They're not getting enough payment for that, but it seems like that would be the obvious policy, right? You just say, okay, this is a no-cut area, because the value is not in the timber, it's in the continuation into something else.
Robin, you should say the answer is the political economy. That's the party line.
I guess, has any work been done on that about introduction or resistance to these things? Because the same with marine protection areas. These are just sort of no-go areas.
But from the top of my head, I think if the government demarks all unclaimed forest and say, this is my responsibility. No, it's your responsibility. You see, politically you are claiming and you have to enforce and everything. Unclaimed land, the government has less. Yeah. So I would imagine that it will have some political issues on that, saying every unclaimed land, every non-private land, government claiming for itself and taking full responsibility for it. It creates some costs. I'll think it.
Political costs.
I'll think so.
Your last set of questions, maybe.
You can call me if I'm taking a long time. I can talk to you during the break, but I like the description on how the higher productivity can lead to intensification or expansion, and that will have different opposite direction. And I have been thinking about this problem in the sense that is forest normal good or inferior good? So if you think higher productivity means higher income, then do you want to increase, would the demand for the forest would go up or go down? And also considering the fact that forests give us a lot of different types of goods, it gives us timber or log, but also it gives us some leisure value, and that might react in the opposite direction if your income goes up or if your productivity goes up. So do you have any kind of idea of I guess it will depend on relative elasticity of demand of these different forestry goods. So have you kind of thought about which type of the good, forestry good would go up as a response to higher productivity? Or is it part of your story?
I mean, the Faruqi et al. Paper, who are co-author, Hadra Pellegrina is a co-author on, kind of thinks about that. And then Jacob and I also have a paper coming out soon, hopefully, that also thinks about this kind of intensification versus expansion, local expansion versus global expansion. Kind of distinction.
I think question is very interesting because there is clearly what you just presented as this productivity paradox. Once you increase productivity, if you have high lands, like big lands, big farmers, they would actually have a bigger incentive, higher incentive to expand production in the forest. And that's precisely the case of Brazil. Most deforestation in Brazil does not happen with small farmers, but with big ones. So you have clearly a problem, which is the forest by itself does not worth too much. And if you cut it, it worth more than when it was standing. You have like clearly a market failure. How do you expect to address this sort of problems? Because if the increase of productivity, which will happen, no matter what the government wants, that's what the farmers will try to do. They will try to increase productivity. So the pressure of the forest will keep on going. How do you address this problem?
So I think it's related with the question of the gentleman in front of you. That's like, if you have vast amount of land, you become more productive. If nobody wants to buy your product, you don't expand. So if you are landlocked, if you have subsistence, local communities, cropping, even if you become more productive, if you don't have where to sell this product, you don't expand. The case like in Brazil, you're giving us this, like you become more productive and you have commodity like demand for soys and beef in the whole world. So then this creates pressure to expand.
So you mean like,
so then what you have to do is we have to think and do, need more research on it. It's on how can we pair increasing productivity, maintaining the agricultural frontier within reasonable limits.
I think we're out of time, but so you can have speakers more questions in the break. We're going to have a break now, and then we're going to be back in, I guess, slightly less than half an hour, where we can thank our speakers for a break.
Thanks.
Yeah.